Today I'm going to give a short roundup about validating bridges and specifically how to secure them, because we've been talking and working a lot on the rollups for quite a long time, but there's all still quite insecure, and therefore there are a lot of trust assumptions that are not there by default that we currently have. So you all of you probably heard about rollups, and you probably heard a lot of people say that they inherit some security guarantees from the underlying base layer, specifically validity, which in this sense, in this context, means enforcement of state transition correctness. Though need to add that that requires the assumption that the underlying proof system functions correctly. So in case of rollups, optimistic rollups, fraud proofs, it's one out of n honesty assumption, and for zero knowledge rollups, that's typically the correctness of their underlying proof system. They also enforce ordering, which means that if a certain transaction sequence is finalized, unless a dishonest majority on the underlying layer reorders it, it guarantees that the sequence is always going to stay in the same order. It's going to remain immutable. Censorship resistance, which is difficult to define, but for this, just to simplify things, we can define it as a guarantee that a transaction, user generated transaction, is going to be included in a block within a certain predefined period of time, assuming that the user pays enough in fees. And finally, data availability, which is just using the underlying layer's ability to distribute data to whomever needs to access it within a certain period of time. And that basically allows us to use the underlying layer to reconstruct the state for the rollup. And that's how we get all the trust minimized bridging that we have on a classic rollup. But in this case, in the case of this presentation, we only care about safety. So specifically, let's define safety for this use case as how can an adversary or a hacker steal your funds? And let's ignore fraud and validity proofs and that they enforce correctness. For this case, it doesn't really matter. So we have a problem. Smart contracts can have bugs, and validating bridges that rollups use are smart contracts, and they're complex smart contracts. So it's difficult to enforce the correctness. So, and the solution is upgradability. So let's say if we find a bug that is critical or quite a serious bug, we have to upgrade, and that we can't wait for, let's say, a month or 2 months before that upgrade is actually enacted. It has to be immediate. And specifically, we use multisigs for that in most of the current setups. And the problem with that is that they require an honesty assumption, which means that you degrade the assumptions of a validating bridge from the correctness of the proof system to an honesty assumption of the multisig. So let's say if there are 12 members of the multisig, you need to assume that 7 of them are honest, for example. And the solution is don't build smart contracts with bugs. No, I wish it was that easy. And actually, the solution requires it's multifaceted and it's quite complex. So, problem one, and I'll divide the solution into subproblems, into two subproblems. Proofs are complex, and the solution is multiprovers. So, what are multiprovers? Multiprovers were originally produced by Vitalik in 2022. It's during his talk at Rollup Day in Bogota that he first spoke about them publicly, and they were concretely expanded by a variation of a multiprover by a proposal by Justin Drake later in the year. Specifically, this one, it's called 2FA ZK rollups using SGX. So essentially, in this case, Justin proposes using SGX as a second prover and enforcing validity of the validating bridge, enforcing the validity only if both proofs agree. So you can think of multiprovers as a setup that requires two or more distinct proof systems to assert the equivalent output. So, and I'll give an example later. And if proof systems disagree, then the validating bridge halts. And then you can have various setups on how to recover from the halt, So you can use a multisig, which picks the correct one, or you can use governance to recover. But that's up to a specific protocol. That's an implementational detail. But what matters is that a single failure of a proof system doesn't cause your funds to be drained. And so for safety to fail, two proof systems have to have identical vulnerabilities, because if two have different bugs, it's unlikely that those two different bugs can cause the same state mutation that will allow the attacker to steal your funds, which means that the probability of this happening is quite low. I would even classify it as negligible. So an example of a multi-prover setup. So you can combine a Halo 2 prover with an SGX prover. So you have a proof system, a zero-knowledge proof system that is Halo 2, and you use Intel SGX as a second prover. And you might think that SGX, it doesn't have a great reputation, but luckily for us in this case, the security is additive because we don't rely the safety of the funds doesn't rely on SGX. It's purely additive here because if it fails, the worst that can happen, the bridge will stop. The prover can never steal funds from you if it fails. And if both function as intended, perfect, then the bridge function is as intended. No problems. We just continue as if there was only one prover. But then if one of the provers, so in this case, Halo 2 or an SGX prover fails, the validating bridge halts. And as I described before, then basically we pass it on to governance or multisig to decide which of the proofs we pick as the correct one, and basically downgrade the security to a single prover, which is not ideal, but it's better than having a single prover that can just get exploited and drain and the money from the bridge drained straight away. And we have another problem, which is smart contracts tend to be prone to bugs. And the solution is multifier, or verifiers in this case. And I was the one that actually proposed multi-verifiers. So the idea of multi-verifiers is to require two or more validating bridge implementations that assert equivalence of the state mutation. So what I mean by it is you essentially implement two different validating bridge just independently from one another, and they share the same storage. And essentially, before committing to the storage, we add a small, as minimal as possible, add-on contract that basically checks that the outputs of the two are the same. So in this case, if the validating bridges disagree, the validating bridge, the protocol just holds. So for example, you can combine a Solidity and a Viper validating bridge implementations. So you'll have two independent bridges, and a small contract that connects those two bridges. And if they disagree from one reason or another, the bridge holds, and then again we pass on the responsibility of picking the correct bridge to multisig or a governance, or again, it's an implementational detail. And again, it's not ideal because if there's a failure, you downgrade your security to a single bridge. But it's, again, as in the previous case, it's better than having just one validating bridge, because that means that if that single validating bridge is exploited, your money is gone. Whereas in here, the worst that happens, there's a liveness failure. So yeah, so as I said, if both validating bridge implementations function as intended, we just proceed as intended. So nothing happens. The user doesn't even notice that there are two different bridge implementations underneath. But if if Solidity of the Viper validating bridge implementation fails, we hold. And of course, in both of those cases, there's a bit of a downside, especially if you combine the two. And the downside is that the gas costs are relatively higher. So in this case, the gas costs would be roughly 50% higher. And plus, if you add a verifier, a prover on top, you'll add 10 or 20% more on top of that. So the user will end up paying more than in a setup where you only have one prover and one verifier. But the advantage here is that you essentially reduce the probabilities or minimize the probability of a proof system and a validating bridge failure, which will result in money being stolen. So the only thing that can happen in this case, again, is a liveness failure, which is not great, but it's a much better trade-off than having your funds drained. And now let's assume that we solve the problem of bugs on the prover and validating bridge level, but there can still be bugs on the specification level, so on the protocol levels, because if you specify the protocol in the way where it's vulnerable, even if you have no implementational bugs, there's still a vulnerability that can be exploited. And maybe formal verification can solve it. And basically, the assumption is this: the combination of multi-provers, multi-verifiers, and formal verification can potentially enable us to remove the need for instant upgrades. So, in case of validating bridge, what would happen is you would have an upgrade, but it will be delayed, and that will. So let's assume that there's a multi-sig or there's governance that decides whether to initiate an upgrade or not. And this delay allows any users that disagree with that upgrade, for whether it's malicious or whether because they don't like the new features introduced, just to exit within that period of time. So Vitalik usually specifies the required delay as 30 days, but you can think of it as, yeah, roughly 30 days or more. So if that's the case, then you essentially have a system which guarantees temporary immutability, so the users don't have to worry about a dishonest security council or a team multisig upgrading the contract and stealing their funds, but also they don't have to worry about the bridge failing because there's an implementational bug or a specification bug on either the validating bridge level or the prover level. Thank you for listening to my talk. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.